Awakened. I recently released my new song Floating Through the Sky with Troves as part of my Memories from Another Life EP on Enhanced Records. So today we're going to do a little bit of a walkthrough and I'm going to show you more about how I made that song. So before I had sent this song to Troves, I had basically written the whole thing out on piano and I had the whole thing structured for the most part. So I'm just going to play you guys this piano progression so you can kind of hear how it all started. Move into the main part of the song here. So once I had that, the idea was inspiring enough that I really had a song. I felt like I could kind of move forwards from there. So that's when I started adding in a lot of extra ambience and strings and stuff like that. So to show you this whole bus, this is basically all the pads. I add in this nice low end bass to go with it. A phasing pad. Kind of gives it this nice width and warmth. Some strings, so it's got a little bit more of that cinematic feel to it. Those strings really open up here especially. Adding in those higher harmonies and melodies. We have a chorus. A really low end pad that I've widened, and this one kind of fills out the stereo field really nicely without adding too much more frequency. This one here, this is a layer that I've used in a lot of my songs, and this is a pad that basically just adds lots of ambience to the song. So this is actually an arpeggiator, and it's playing something like the chord progression, but it doesn't move quite as much. You'll see that these notes here mostly stay static. There's little bits of variation on the lowest fundamental tone here, but for the most part, this one kind of adds a lot of space. So this is what this sounds like. I widened it up quite a bit with this utility here because I really wanted this one to just add lots of space to the song. It's not adding a lot of tone, I added a EQ here to cut out lots of the low end. So it's mostly just creating that ambient space that you hear in the intro. For this particular element, it's kind of interesting because if you turn off reverb, it's kind of this very simple arpeggiator, just this little pluck. And this is something I made in Serum. I'm a big fan of using really simple patches. So when I make sounds, I use really simple patches. This is just a saw wave here, sine wave here. And you can hear it's pretty simple in its design. There's not a whole lot going on in the effects section, mostly just a little delay and reverb to give it some space. Downsample distortion, which is what gives it that high-end aesthetic. And then a bit of erosion as well, which is adding some noise. And then when I turn on my reverb, it washes it all out and turns it into this really big pad. So I've got 50 seconds worth of decay here and the mix is all the way up. So it just completely drowns out the sound in reverb. The other really important part in the introduction that I've used here is the lead. So there's a couple of layers going on here. I've got this nice piano. And if we look at it, it's giving a little bit of distortion on the high end from this redux distortion inside of Ableton. So it's like a downsample distortion. And this is actually Alicia's Keys. I'm a huge fan of this plugin. It's a Contact plugin. It's like $100 or something like that. And I use it for basically all of my pianos. It's a really nice piano. And here, this is another layer, which is more or less the same as that pad I had just showed you guys. Tons of reverb. And very simple patch in Serum. But this is, instead of being a pad, playing along with the same melodic notes that the piano above is playing along with. And then when we move into this section, I've added another element here for some more ambience. So this is going to be another lead that follows along with the piano. And it's adding a nice top lead on top of the strings as well that goes with the pianos here. So if we listen to it all together, this new layer here adds a lot of space and distortion. Okay, so moving right along into the next section here, into the chorus.
I'm floating through the sky, getting high, 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 yeah. I'm going deep to find the light, yeah.
So transitioning into this section, this is where a lot of the energy is going to start. You know, the introduction sort of gives you this feeling of the song, and, you know, Troves does a great job of sort of introducing the idea here. And as we move into the chorus, you know, this is where the core idea of the song starts to really come out. So I have a lot of effects here transitioning so that we can kind of get pulled into this section. You know, so I've got a few different things here. I use a lot of cashmere samples for this kind of stuff. And then I like to add reverb on top of those to kind of give it a little bit of a tail. And I've got some more high-end stuff here. Got this really nice low-end impact, and I used a mid-side EQ to cut out a lot of the low end from the width of it, so it's a little more centered. You know, another sweep here where I've got that reverb again, kind of creating a tail here, so I automate that dry wet, so it kind of pulls up and brings us into the next section here. So just a lot of effects and stuff that are causing the energy to transfer from one section into the next section. This really distinguishes the chorus as a fresh starting point here. So above, this is where the movement begins to happen. So I've got some chord plucks here that begin. And so this is going to be playing the same chord progression, but we have two different synths doing it. And you'll hear them as they progress, kind of adding different things. This bottom one here is a little bit more transient oriented and not quite as tonal. This one's going to add most of the body, so together kind of got this nice biting feeling to it, especially as we move into the build. You know, and this is another example where the construction of the chord plucks is pretty simple. So if we listen to this, you know, another thing I made in Serum here, and it's very simple, not much going on here. One slightly interesting thing is that the LFO I've set to an eighth note is basically automating the fine tuning. So it gives it this little bit of movement that's sort of subtle to the ear, but if I were to turn this way up, it becomes really obvious and kind of off-putting. But just this little bit of it adds this extra bit of movement that the ear can't quite detect, but it makes it a little bit more interesting to listen to. Nice short plucky envelope going on the filter here. Again, we have the downsample distortion inside of Serum. I'm a big fan of that effect. Without it, just a little bit more plain. Hyperdimension and chorus are adding a little bit of space and width to this one. And then we're going to be automating the filter cutoff here as we move forward. So as we get into the build, this filter cutoff is going to move quite a bit. You know, it starts off very low, so that it's just adding this nice subtle. It's like those chord plucks are almost not even there. And then there's lots of EQing going on as well here. You can see that there's lots of dips and things like that where the frequencies I cut out were just a bit harsh or muddy or kind of getting in the way. So if I turn off my EQs here, you know, the sound is a lot larger, a lot heavier and muddier on the low end. So especially with this mid-side EQ here, I've cut out lots of low end between 100 and about 1,000 hertz to center it a little bit more, give it a little bit more space. This EQ did a little bit more shaping because there was just a lot of extra stuff that I didn't need going on, especially towards the end of the build here. And then we have the second layer down low here. This one comes in a little more subtly and progresses as the build goes forward. So as we get up into the build here, this filter really starts to open up and allow that transient to cut through. We've also got that filter opening up as well to really cut through and give it some bite as we go up. So those are the chord plucks, and if we look above, we have the pad bus that we can take a look into. So there's a few things going on in here. Got a really nice strong sub. Got a chorus, kind of adding a little bit of ambience. This is actually an element that I use quite often. It adds a lot of interesting space and movement because it has this LFO on the filter. So it's a bandpass filter, and you can see this LFO is 2 bars long. So it causes this filter to open up just a little bit over that 2 bars. And then what happens there is the distortion, which is oddly enough being created mostly by the drive knob on this filter, that causes the distortion to then come through this filter, and then that moves around as a result of the fact that there's a long release. And then I've got some reverb as well, so it has this long tail to it whenever that LFO lets loose. And so it's kind of like this moving distortion that creates this cool space that moves around a little bit. Got that layer up top here again, creating that distorted feeling. It's really subtle, but it's adding this extra little bit of distortion on top of that pad. The other thing we've got is a phaser pad. This is something I found out about from a AU5 tutorial. This is very similar to a pad that I watched him make inside of his tutorial. It's very simple in how you make it. Just some saw waves, really. Lots of detune on both layers. This one's an octave up. It's got a little bit of a release on it, so it doesn't stay super static. And then it's got this phaser turned on as well. But not much in the effects section, really. Just really simple saw waves. Delay for some width and movement. EQ to cut out some low end. Compression to kind of tame some of those high end frequencies. And then a bit of reverb here to give it more of a spacey tail. You know, again, with the with the EQ here, lots of stuff getting cut out. The sound gets a lot bigger without those. You know, because I have a lot of filtering and stuff going on here to kind of open it up as the song progresses into the build. And then the last thing is just some nice saw waves to add warmth to the center. So altogether, that's that pad bus plus the chord bus we have here. And those effects that we talked about earlier. Those leads, of course, adding a nice bit of ambience and feeling to this section. Okay, so now we're going to move into the build-up and kind of take a look at how we introduce the drop and kind of start to build momentum and energy. So we've got similar effects from the previous section. You know, really strong transitioning effects to really pull you into this build-up and let you know, okay, something is going to start happening here. We've got the build drums. So we've got some claps, and I'm using the Haas effect here by having this one panned to the left, this one panned to the right, and then this one has about 8 milliseconds worth of delay. So this one's playing 8 milliseconds sooner than this one is. And so having the panning plus that delay kind of adds this width into the stereo field. The main build snare here is actually an arpeggiator with a drum rack. And so the decay of this is causing it to stutter a little bit, so that it's not just this static 16th note, but rather it's more of this kind of fluttering, stuttering build snare. Of course, we have filters here that are going to be opening up as the build goes forwards, and then the decay opens all the way up for that last part of the build so that the snare sample becomes more static. Transpose here towards the end to give it a little bit of pitch bend. And this is another thing I learned from a AU5 tutorial, so shout out to Austin for that one. We've also got some cinematic toms going on in this section to kind of create movement. I usually like to layer several different packages together here, so I've kind of got the main cashmere loop going on, some EQing and some compression there. But then I've also taken some one-shots and kind of layered that in there with the cinematic tom loop. There's one more section down here, some big kind of one shots that are a little heavier. And so together, you know, these cinematic toms are really starting to add a little bit of momentum to the situation. Finally, we've got a kick build-up here. So this is adding in low end and kind of sub to the snare drums, and then just a little bit of a white noise hit towards the end here to add a little bit more space. And then all the effects kind of start to build up here. So we've got a lot of stuff going on. Got some white noise. Got this section going on here. Little sub drop right before, and then the drop comes. The other thing with this build up is that we have the same elements from before. So we've got our pads and our chord plucks. Of course, the filters are opening up further and further here, allowing in more frequencies and more energy. The volume's going up a bit. And then we've got our lead chords, as well as our lead on the drop. And so we start to tease those. You know, the drop leads come in, but they're filtered down, so they're kind of subtle at first. Same with the chords. They're adding this nice width and this nice warmth, but they are filtered down quite intensely at first. And as the build goes up, that filter gets opened up to kind of open up more energy. Towards the very end, they're basically wide open. Short little fill right before the drop. And then everything kind of hits all at once. So that's the majority of the build up there. Okay, so let's take a look at the drop here. So the way I like to structure my drops is to layer together all of the chords and mid basses, and then the white noise that I layer in there separately. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's what all this sounds like. And then we've got my lead bus here. So I like to separate those things because it makes it so I can have separate sidechain compression for the lead bus and the stack, which is the chords and the basses. But then also I can have separate EQs, separate filters, and separate automations for distortion, auto pan, phasing, chorus, things like that. Because I like to add a lot of fills, and I like to make a lot of little cuts and moments where like cool things are happening and glitches are being added in. Separately down here on the low end, we've got the sub. Something that I find really useful for sub bass, instead of using a sidechain compressor, I turn that off. For sub bass, I actually do volume automation. That leaves for just a lot more space for the kick drum to really breathe. And it's just a lot more precise. I find that having a really clean low end is just super important, and using a volume automation allows you to completely silence that sub bass for some period of time while the kick is playing. You know, this definitely requires a lot of back and forth to get it right, but I think that volume automation ultimately just leaves more precise low end between the kick and the sub bass relationship. So let's dive into the chords a little bit and take a look at that. I like to have usually 2 to 3 chord layers. So for this drop, I have 2 layers, and it's usually a very wide detuned layer that sounds like this. And you can see how much high end and stuff I'm cutting out. You know, with these EQs, I'm cutting out all kinds of frequencies here. So if I unfreeze this and turn off all my EQs, you know, you can hear that sound becomes much bigger. There's a lot more low end, there's a lot more high end. And so with the EQs back on, it's a lot more shaped. I also like to widen it quite a bit, because this really pushes it into the stereo field and gives the listener this feeling of width and size. The other layer I have here, it's this much less detuned and a lot more centered probably more distorted with a bit more high end on it as well. Still some simple saw waves, a saturator for some distortion, and then again, lots of EQ here. And I'm a big fan of mid-side EQing because that allows me to cut out things from the width, since I don't really need this element to be very wide. So together, these two chords sound like this. And then if I add my white noise, and then above we have our mid basses. So let's hear all of those together. So that actually really makes up a lot of the drop here. If I listen to the chords without those, they're pretty thin, you know, they're just adding a little bit of tone. So I think using mid bass is a great way to create a lot of size and energy on a drop. Usually I have 3 to 4 layers. This one is going to be nice and low end oriented. And I've shaved off a lot of high end from this one. You can see in the EQs I have here. I've widened it, so it adds that nice depth of field, you know, and it gives you that nice wide bass feeling. This one, also very wide, is mostly adding a lot of distortion, and with a mid-side EQ here, I've cut out a lot of the low end so that that other bass can kind of shine through. You know, it's still got some low end, but not nearly as much. This one's more adding high-end distortion to the situation. I've got another mid bass. This one's very centered. Lots and lots of gritty, grindy distortion, you know, to kind of create that depth since these two are super wide. So we have this nice centered one here. And finally, we've got one more very wide, very high-end oriented layer. This one's got a bit of distortion on it, so it kind of creates this interesting grinding feeling. You know, saturator there to give it more distorted feeling, but in its design, again, this one's really simple. Not a crazy amount of effects or anything going on here in Serum. It's mostly just a very distorted saw wave. And so if we listen to our stack bus here, with the sub bass now, that's what that sounds like all together. And so the reason I like to bus everything together like this is because I talked about earlier briefly, I like to create a lot of little cuts and movements and things like that. So this is my main volume automation here. So this is where I'm basically silencing everything inside of this bus momentarily. And you'll hear, if I were to turn these off, there's other things happening in those moments. So inside of all these little volume cuts that I make, I'll add percussion, I'll add glitch samples, I'll add all kinds of fun stuff in there. And this is, I would say, probably one of the signature things that makes my drops sound the way that they do. I like to add lots of these little volume cuts so that I have space for other elements to come in there. So taking a brief look through the leads here. You know, I find it's very important with my lead bus that I have a lot of different aesthetics, and some are wide, some are narrow, many different octaves and things like that going on here as well. So I'm just going to play each one for you for a moment. Give you an idea for how many different sorts of things I have going on here. So something between 6 to 10 layers of leads is pretty normal for me. And again, it's because there's a mix of distortion happening, a mix of width, a mix of octaves. Some are playing more harmonies, some are just playing one really strong lead note. So there's a lot of different things going on here. And my lead bus is going to have a slightly different volume automation pattern to my chord bus, because the leads themselves are actually doing some interesting things while the chords are muted. And so I'll take the leads oftentimes and automate things like redux distortion here. You'll see this very oftentimes. So like in this example, this is kind of a step ladder of distortion going up. And I've also added this other sample above. to give it more feeling. A lot of auto pen and stuff like that, which is what sometimes can help me to create these little chord chops. Sometimes I'll add phaser, especially in conjunction with filters and stuff, you know, and phaser automation can create a really cool effect and kind of move us into the next section here, which is what's happening. And then to give you an idea for the glitches and stuff, we can listen to those. Going with the percussion here. You know, so these are coming from a lot of different places. I make some of them. I get some of them from different companies like Glitch Machine and lots of other really nice sample libraries like that. Sometimes it's bass samples from sample packs and stuff like that. And I just like to layer them together in really interesting ways. And then sometimes even add my own distortion and automation to those. The percussion in this drop is fairly straightforward, fairly simple. Not a lot of processing. I try to leave my percussion fairly unprocessed. So just kind of a nice clean kick, a little bit of the high end taken off of it. And then I've got a couple of snare layers here. Actually, those are the rides going along with the kicks. You know, we've got some hi-hats creating a little bit of movement here. Got those open hi-hats there to kind of pull us along to section. And there's our snares. So I like to do this a lot with snares where I'll have one pretty wide kind of reverby layer there, and then one really nice, clean, centered layer that doesn't have a lot of movement. I find it's really good to shave off a little bit of the transient from the snare if you have a kick above. You know, that kick is providing most of the transient, so that snare doesn't need too much of that information in there. But it's really nice to have a very clean, dry, centered snare like that, and then another nice wide kind of reverby layer. And on this one, I'm doing some volume automation because I've got a pretty strong reverb, so I don't want that tail cutting out into the rest of the drop. So I'm kind of cutting out the volume of that reverb in between each sample, just to give it that nice, short, snappy, spacious feeling. So the percussion here all together always nice to have some kind of a crash cymbal, something like that, to accompany the very beginning of the drop. So there's this little gap here, and that crash, which I've added a bit of reverb and chorus to, kind of creates this extra bit of energy and space right when that drop hits. So yeah, guys, that's the whole song. Hope you guys enjoyed the walkthrough today. I'm sure I'm going to be doing more of these in the future. Thanks for following along. Peace.